Hello and welcome to the Age of Light Innovations interview series. It's an absolute pleasure and delight and honour to welcome Stephen Lockley, who's a fellow Brit but has escaped to Boston and I came across his amazing work as a neuroscientist who runs a team in Harvard all about sleep and circadian rhythms, and he's done some really fantastic work not only about how sleep works but also particularly how light affects sleep. And he's got some really great super simple tips of how we can use light in our homes differently, and avoid some of the sort of more elaborate high-tech solutions and simply get back to basics. So perhaps if we could begin, Stephen, one of the stories that we hear a lot is, there's sunrise, it's warm, and then it gets brighter blue, and then it goes into evening. So these very elaborate tunable systems need to have all those different, and it gets quite overwhelming, really. And perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more, as we were talking before, about actually what's happening, how much light we need, what color light we need, and how that works.
Okay, well, hi Shelley, thank you. Thanks for having me on the series. And so light is absolutely vital to our biology. And I think we underestimate how important light is for maintaining our normal day-to-day physiology. We take it for granted. We don't really think about it much until you don't have light. But light's doing a lot of things for us each and every day. And one of the main jobs for light is to reset our circadian clocks, our 24-hour clocks in the brain. And light does that every single day. If you were to live in a cave without light, or if you were unfortunate enough not to have light perception or not to have eyes, and I've studied lots of people with different types of blindness, your clock can't synchronize to the 24-hour day. And so you start to drift on your own internal time, which is often a little bit longer than 24 hours. And so we need a daily light-dark pattern to keep our clocks in check. And then the clock controls many other things. So it controls your sleep patterns, your alertness, performance, metabolism, many hormones, your mood. And so it's important that we get that regular daily light-dark exposure to keep the circadian clock working properly. Now, in terms of the type of light, we need to think about what did we evolve in? What was the light source that we evolved this clock in? And of course, that was the sun. And the sun is a very regular light-dark cycle. It doesn't change very much day to day. And so the circadian system is expecting this regular light days and dark nights in order to synchronize to that 24-hour pattern. And so when we think about light for ourselves, maybe outside of a daylit space, we need to think about, well, what's the sun doing? Now, you mentioned there's a change at dawn and another change at dusk, but they're really very rapid changes. And are not really being measured in the day length of time. So we might be in light for 10, 12, 14, 16 hours a day. And those changes at dawn and dusk are quite quick. And so they're not really doing much in terms of giving the signal. It's really the whole day length that the brain is detecting. And so if you think about what daylight is, well, it's very bright. So you need to think about high intensity light in the daytime. And sunlight peaks in the blue part of the spectrum. And that's important because we now know, after work that discovered a new photoreceptor about 20 years ago, that blue light is the most important wavelength for stimulating these effects on the clock, or affecting alertness, or affecting sleep. And so in the sun, you have the right light at the right time. You have high intensity, blue enriched light to give that clock a signal in the day. And then in the evening, before sleep, after dusk, we want to take that away. We want to dim the light down. We want to have a less blue source, so something that's more red-orange, a bit more like a firelight type light. If you can't be in darkness, that's what you would really want to have between dusk and sleep time to calm the brain down so you're not giving that continuing alerting signal. And so really the simple message for your light exposure to keep your rhythms in check is regularity. Try and get the same light exposure in terms of timing day to day, and then bright blue days, and then dark nights. And if you keep that contrast, the clock will find its time, it will reset itself, and everything that the clock controls will then all come into sync.
But you mentioned it's broadly the same number of hours a day, but actually certainly here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're moving into autumn and winter, and I'm very acutely aware of how much shorter the days are. But as we go back to school, the kids are doing their homework, we are working from home, so we're in artificial light we might have a couple of hours of daylight where we're actually outside, but most of the time we're in artificial light. So are you suggesting that we should maintain the same number of hours of exposure to bright blue peak sun-like light a day?
So we do detect season. So it's not that season doesn't affect our biology, and we in fact detect it through a hormone called melatonin, which waxes and wanes with night duration. And so the body and the brain do know what season we're in. But in terms of the circadian rhythm, it doesn't change very much from day to day. So certainly there's a big change between winter and summer, but it's only a few minutes a day that you would see a change between two consecutive days. And so those changes still manage to synchronize the clock detects that and keeps us in sync. Now, in a natural light environment, you would do things differently in the winter. You probably would go to bed earlier. You probably would sleep a little longer. Your body clock would shift itself slightly in its timing compared to the summer, because that would be the only light source we have. But of course, if you mentioned, we have now man-made electric lighting sources, so we can extend our days in the winter. And if we're going to do that, which we do practically, then we need to think about what type of light we're exposing ourselves to. If you're in a place where you're not trying to sleep, then you want to be alert. You want to be awake, you want to be productive. And so if you're at school or in the office or doing a daytime type behavior, you still want that blue enriched white light that's high intensity light. But as soon as you're in a place where you might sleep, and that could be your home, but that could also be a hospital, it could be a care home, then you need to start thinking about the light before bedtime. Now, you're not going to start dimming the lights down at 4 o'clock in the UK when it starts to go dark in the winter, but you do need to think, what am I going to do for the 2 to 3 hours before bed? And for that time, try to start to minimize both the intensity and the blue content. And so that means a type of firelight, candlelight, that sort of red-orange light, but also as dim as possible. And you should try to do that for as long as you can before sleep. As I said, ideally 2 to 3 hours. But if you can't do that long, then the more you can do, the better. Try and do something to really give the brain a chance to calm down, be less alert, and prepare itself for sleep. So you're not going to follow exactly the seasonal changes, but do think about your light exposure, and particularly in the 2 to 3 hours before bed.
So I've got questions for two kind of groups of children and young people. The first, I suppose, is teenagers who will be on their screens doing homework or doing other kinds of things, possibly until quite late in the evening. So are you saying that, because we know that blue light comes, screens give off blue light. So is the idea that they should switch off those screens 2 to 3 hours before bed?
Ideally, yes. And that's important for not only their sleep, but also we think their longer term health. And so, as you said, these electronic devices do pump out a lot of the blue light that alerts the brain. And we're a little bit more concerned about screen use compared to, say, a TV, because it's much closer to the eyes. And so compared to a TV, which might be 2 or 3 meters away, the screen is right here. And so the light intensity is very high at the eyes, from a phone, from a tablet, from a laptop. And so you really do want to take that break for as long as you can before sleep. Now, the reason for that is that light continues its effects even after you turn it off. And so a little bit like caffeine has a half-life and will continue stimulating you after you stop drinking caffeine, light will continue alerting the brain after you turn it off for at least a couple of hours. And so colleagues of ours in Basel, in Switzerland, showed that if you kept the blue enriched light on close to bedtime, you would suppress deep sleep for at least the first hour and a half of sleep. And so those alerting effects of light continue on. And what's important about that deep sleep is that that's the only time you produce growth hormone. And so if you're a developing child and you reduce the amount of deep sleep because you've had light before bed, you will reduce the amount of growth hormone, and that's going to have long-term impacts on brain and body development. And so, again, while it's not going to be possible for everyone to always have 2 or 3 hours before bed without them, keep a longest gap as possible. And if you have to use a screen, think about using the software that you can install that starts to dim and redden the screen in the evening. There's a free one called f.lux, for example, that will automatically start to change your screen settings to make it a little bit dimmer and a little bit redder. And that will also give you a good signal to go to bed. If you can't see the screen anymore, it's time to go to bed.
The thing starts to do. So, I mean, there are also blue glasses, sort of different kinds of blue filters out there. I mean, what would you say about those?
So they do something that they're not as good as switching off the device. They are still letting light through. And although we know that blue light is the most important wavelength, other wavelengths of light also have an impact. It's just not as strong as the blues. And so if you only wear a blue blocking pair of sunglasses, you're not blocking all the effects. If you really wanted to do that, you'd want to wear dark sunglasses in the evening, and that is a solution that you could use. But really, we should think about our screen time and try and make sure we have that gap between screen stop and bedtime for as long as we can. And that's particularly difficult in teenagers, because teenagers have a clock which is set slightly later than adults and younger children. And so they naturally want to stay up late and work later and can't go to sleep earlier. And one of the things they might do is then use a screen. And so we really do need to think carefully about teenagers doing this and make sure they have this gap, even though it might be later in the evening, because that light at night is going to exacerbate their problems and make it even harder for them to get up in the morning. So it's not teenagers' fault that they are not able to fall asleep early and can't wake up in the morning, but light will make it worse if you keep seeing light late into the evening. And so teenagers particularly want to have that gap before bed.
Tell me, that's fascinating. I'm just logging that. Talking to you about little tiny children, because I understand that, I mean, when babies are born, they haven't set their clock yet. And we know that more and more children and young people, sort of toddlers, are spending time using screens. Tell me about the formation of the circadian rhythm in little ones, and what, as adults, we can do to support sort of a healthy establishment of that rhythm.
Yeah, so when babies are first born, they don't have a circadian rhythm. They have an ultradian rhythm, which is something that's less than circadian. So that would be a 4-hour cycle where they might nap and eat in about a 4-hour cycle. After a few weeks, maybe about 6 weeks or so, you start to see a rhythm, but it's not synchronized yet to 24 hours. It's as if the light information is not yet getting through because of the formation of the development of those pathways. But after about 3 months or so, most babies can start to synchronize or at least detect that daily light-dark cycle. And so then it's really important to have that strong day-night signal. Now, right exactly at 3 months, it's not as if a baby's going to start to be perfectly synchronized exactly at that time. And it will, of course, differ in different children as people develop at slightly different rates. But providing that strong light-dark cycle will give the time cue for baby's brain to lock onto when the brain is ready to do that. And then you'll also notice, probably based on studies people have done, that the timing of sleep starts to shift a bit earlier as baby gets older, to about 6 months or so. You'll also notice that the consolidation of sleep and wake changes. So, of course, at the start of life, we have lots of naps in the daytime. And then as we get older, we start to have fewer naps in the day and more of that consolidated sleep at night. And so again, providing a dark environment to sleep in at night is key. A strong day-night cycle is key. Darkness when baby's having a nap is key, because light is going to keep them awake. But give that strong environmental light-dark time cue so that the clock can lock on as soon as it can.
Particularly as you mentioned, the growth hormone that is produced during that deep sleep. And I mean, I suppose for babies that growth hormone is, I mean, it's important for everybody, but for children, that must be a particularly vital thing.
It is. So that would be one example, but there's also many other changes happening during sleep. And one thing that young children particularly have a lot of is REM sleep. And so we have both what's called REM, rapid eye movement, and non-REM sleep. And the younger you are, the bigger proportion of sleep tends to be REM. And we think that's vital for learning and memory. And so REM sleep is a time in sleep where we're forming particular types of memories. And so we think that the babies have a lot of REM because they're learning so much. They are taking in all that information. And so sleep is important for learning and development, for hormonal changes, for rest and recuperation. We don't really know what sleep does, except we know that if you don't have it, things go downhill very quickly. And one of the newer theories about what sleep is doing is essentially clearing out the brain at night. And so we take in a lot of information. The brain is super active in the day, and then at night it seems that the brain is cleared out, ready for the next day. And so it's really important to get sleep for lots of different reasons, especially in younger children who are then learning and developing. And there's really no limit. We can't really sleep too much if we're healthy. And young children, babies, young children, teenagers should be getting probably more sleep than most of them do. Sleep is a very good thing. And so encouraging sleep, protecting the time for sleep, creating the right environment for sleep, this should be a real priority in children of all ages.
And you mentioned, so with children, I suppose small children, and actually as they grow into teenage, this sort of 2 to 3 hour time in, I suppose, dim warm light without the blues, that sounds like that's really important. But when we spoke before, you said that actually any light is an issue. Is that, tell me a little bit about that.
Well, all light is unnatural after dusk. And so we've evolved to see darkness after dusk, and there'd be very little light in our environment from the moon or from the stars. And so any light after dusk is unnatural. But what we're trying to do with that advice is minimize the impact of light. And so the dimmer the light is, the redder the light is, then the less effect it's going to have. It's not going to have no effect because it's not darkness, but it will minimize the impact. And so again, to be practical, we're all not going to go to bed at 4 p.m. In January. And so we're not going to live on a natural light pattern anymore. But if we're not going to do that, how can we then minimize the negative impact of that light in the evening? And so the closer you get to bedtime, the more important that becomes. And so I'm less concerned about you using a screen at 5 p.m. than I am at 10 p.m. Because the closer to bedtime, the worse it is. But I want people to think about their light exposure and proactively try and minimize that. And so think, well, what am I going to be doing this evening? Can I stop using the screen? Can I sit a long way from the TV? Can I turn the lights off? Do I even need an evening light on in the lounge? And then how can I maybe change my light bulbs? And we'll get to that in a second of what people can do to do that. But just think about your light exposure. And if you can't dim the light for 3 hours, dim it for 2. If you can't do 2, do it for 1. If you can only do 30 minutes, do that. Do what you can to minimize that impact.
Perhaps before we go on to the solutions, just share why it's so important, because we sort of say, oh, growth hormones. Just, I mean, you said things go downhill. Let's just spend a couple of minutes reminding ourselves why it's really worth making the effort, because you've done some really beautiful work on that. So just tell us in a couple of minutes what it does if we don't get a proper night's sleep.
So sleep, we think about sleep as being one of the 3 pillars of good health, along with exercise and nutrition. And I'm biased. I think sleep is the most important of those, because sleep is fundamental to all of our biology. If you don't sleep for a few days, things start to go downhill very quickly. And in fact, in experiments where people have looked at what happens to animals that are sleep deprived, whole organ failure happens. Everything starts to fail. The brain fails, the liver fails, the kidneys fail. Sleep is there to really restore our function every single day. And so if you lose it for just 3 or 4 days, you can be in serious trouble. You could not necessarily be in the same amount of trouble if you didn't eat for 3 or 4 days, if you had water. And so you could even talk about sleep being more important than food in terms of maintaining our brain and body function. And so sleep is cleaning out the brain. As I said, it's restoring our function. It's particularly important for mental health. And so we know that people who don't sleep well often have a higher risk of mental health disorders, and people with mental health disorders often don't sleep well. There is a two-way relationship And so particularly in teenagers, where there are increased risk of mental health problems, sleep is really key for maintaining both physical and mental health. And so it's absolutely fundamental. We can't live without it, and you can't really get enough of it.
Okay, great. Let's just finish off with a very simple solution, because there's lots of really gorgeous, tunable, complicated solutions, time solutions to kind of create the sunrise and then into the afternoon. And we'll be speaking to some manufacturers about that in a later part of the interview series. But you just have a very fantastically simple, practical and affordable solution. So perhaps you just share that with us.
Yeah, so think about what you're trying to achieve. When you are in a space where you're not asleep or not trying to sleep, you want to be alert. And so a simple way to do that is to increase the intensity and increase the blue content of the light, which will be a light that looks cooler. On the side of the box, it might have what's called a high correlated color temperature, higher CCT value, something above, say, 5,000 Kelvin or higher. And you want to give yourself those bright blue enriched days. But then in the evening before sleep, when you're in a space where you want to sleep, your home, a care home, a hospital, then you need to dim and redden the light and have a warmer looking light, a lower color temperature, if you look on the side of the box, something say around 2,700 Kelvin. Now there are those tunable systems, as you say, that will do it automatically for you, but you don't need to do that. You could just put the right light bulb in the right place for the right time. And so what I mean by that is, in your bedroom, you've probably got a ceiling light and you've probably got a bedside lamp. And so in the ceiling, you can buy the brighter, bluer enriched white light bulb for daytime. And then in the evening before sleep, you use your dimmer, redder looking bedside light. In your lounge, you probably have a ceiling light and then a table lamp. Put the day lamp in the ceiling, the sleepy lamp in the table lounge. In the bathroom, you could probably do the same. In the kitchen, you could probably do the same. And so it really just is a matter of putting the right light bulb in for the right time, and then just using it that way. Blue enriched, high intensity in the day, blue depleted and dimmer at night. And so you can buy a complex system if you want to have the sleek, modern, automated version, but you can also just put the right light bulb in the right place and do it yourself.
That's a great way to end. And it sounds as though the main thing to do is to switch off, or at least dim down, and make sure you get enough sleep, because it literally keeps us alive. It sounds as though that's the bottom line, isn't it? And particularly for children and growing people, or even aging people, that it's the bottom line, isn't it, to keep us healthy and happy.
It really is. Sleep is absolutely key to our health. And so bright days, dark nights, sleep with an eye mask if your room's not dark. That will also help a lot in blocking the light. And think about sleep, prioritize sleep, and then think about your light exposure so you can help get as much sleep as you can.
Thanks again for your time, Stephen. That was really fascinating. And it's just so good to hear such uncomplicated, straightforward advice from such an eminent scientist in the field. So thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.